You pass by these majestic structures every day, without even suspecting that you are looking at the greatest architectural falsification in human history. Right now, in the center of almost every old city, a monumental red brick building rises, which official science contemptuously calls a banal 19th century water tower. Watch this material to the end, and your worldview will change forever. Because you will see with your own eyes 100% proof of a grandiose deception, the scale of which stuns any imagination. You will understand why academic historians panic at inconvenient questions about these luxurious brick castles scattered across our planet. Why should you know this? Because a society unable to question its past is completely defenseless against manipulations in the present. He who controls the historical narrative dictates your future. And right now, they are selling you an incredibly cheap and illogical fairy tale to hide the colossal level of technological development of our not-so-distant ancestors. Look at these towers really carefully, discarding imposed school dogmas. Each of them is a true masterpiece of architecture that would easily suit a country residence of an influential monarch or a powerful aristocrat of the highest rank. Before us unfolds the most complex Gothic masonry, graceful arches, pointed windows with filigree frames, intricate stained glass, multi-level cornices with stunning attention to the smallest details of the facade. This is not just fired clay laid in layers. This is a true frozen symphony in stone. We are seriously asked to believe that incredibly pragmatic engineers and stingy city officials of the past, who counted literally every penny in the municipal budget, suddenly decided to turn an ordinary reservoir for technical fluid into a world-class architectural marvel. Try to comprehend this paradox. Why build a luxurious palace for a banal water pipe? Official history frankly takes us for naive fools who blindly believe any absurdity written in a textbook or tourist guide. They tell us, with a knowing look, endless touching stories about how city authorities easily spent astronomical sums comparable to the cost of building grand cathedral churches just to provide pressure in the city water supply. They are actively trying to convince us that the aesthetic demands of society at that time categorically required even a purely utilitarian water pumping station to inevitably look like an impregnable medieval fortress. But real engineering and harsh economics don't work that way, and never have. No commercial or governmental entity in its right mind would ever inflate the budget hundreds or thousands of times solely for the dubious embellishment of a technical facility. When an industrialist builds a factory workshop, coal shed, or pumping station, he doesn't hire the best architects of his era to create ornate stucco on the facades, or order figured portals over the entrance. He uses the cheapest, most available, and efficient materials to solve the specific task. However, before our eyes stand silent giants, whose construction required the highest qualifications of thousands of masons, the most complex mathematical calculations, and utterly colossal financial resources. These brick castles proudly and arrogantly rise above the old quarters, monstrously dissonating with the modest wooden or simple stone buildings surrounding them from that time. They look like aliens from another reality. Foreign objects accidentally ended up in the gray era of horse-drawn carriages, mud on unpaved roads, and dim kerosene lamps. And the longer you look at them, analyzing every detail, the clearer you begin to understand that a grandiose, well-rehearsed spectacle is being played out before you. These astonishing structures can be found in every major settlement, from European capitals to remote provincial towns on other continents. They were built according to amazingly similar architectural canons, as if copied carbon copy absolutely independently of local culture and climatic conditions. Isn't it strange that the whole world was suddenly seized by the same mad mania to build palaces for pumps and pipes? This global synchronicity finally destroys the myth of the whims of individual local rulers. They simply sold us a beautiful decoration, making us believe that this majestic heritage of the past is merely primitive communal infrastructure for pumping liquid. The true purpose of these masterpieces was completely different, and water has absolutely no relation to their original design. We have grown accustomed to not noticing the engineering absurdities surrounding us, because the outright lie has been repeated from generation to generation, millions of times, until it became an irrefutable truth. But if you brush off the dust of academic hypnosis, you will see gaping holes in the official version that cannot be explained by fleeting fashion or concern for the beauty of the urban landscape. This is a monumental crime against logic, and its silent witnesses stand on the main squares of your cities, awaiting the moment when people finally open their eyes. Let us leave aesthetics aside and turn to dry, ruthless numbers, because mathematics and physics do not know how to lie to please rewritten textbooks. Imagine a typical water reservoir structure. In its physical essence, it is simply a huge barrel that needs to be raised to a certain height to create hydrostatic pressure in the piping system. To hold a mass of water, say 13,000 or 26,000 gallons, at a height of 100 feet, an engineer needs only a simple, reliable, and maximally cheap supporting structure. The most logical and economically justified solution, which is mass applied in truly utilitarian structures, is a prefabricated metal frame on several supports. Such a lattice tower is erected in a couple of weeks, requires a minimal amount of building materials, and brilliantly copes with its single task. It costs mere pennies compared to capital buildings. But what do we see in the case of our mysterious brick giants? We encounter engineering nonsense that makes any competent designer grab his head. The thickness of the load-bearing walls at the base of many such towers reaches astonishing dimensions of 6 or even 10 feet of solid masonry. Think for a second about this monstrous, completely unjustified redundancy. 6 or 10 feet of high-quality, perfectly fired red brick around the entire perimeter of a colossal octagon or cylinder. To erect just one such object required millions of units of building material. Each brick had to be manufactured at a factory, dried, fired in kilns with enormous consumption of wood or coal, then loaded onto carts, transported to the construction site, and unloaded. After that, a whole army of highly qualified masons came into play, who for months meticulously laid each tier, using the most complex mortars and maintaining perfect geometry. If we convert these labor costs and volumes of materials into the monetary equivalent of that time, we will get an astronomical estimate. The cost of building one such brick mountain exceeded the cost of the very water it was supposedly supposed to pump by dozens and hundreds of times. This is an absolutely unprofitable, economically stillborn enterprise. No city council of the 19th century, where every cent was accounted for, would approve a water tower project that cost as much as building a large industrial complex or a city theater. To realize the full scale of this construction absurdity, it is enough to look at the genuine utilitarian structures of that era. What did real factories, manufactories, spinning shops, or foundries look like? They were long, boring, maximally functional sheds made of the cheapest brick or wood, with ordinary flat walls without the slightest hint of elegance. Capital owners knew perfectly well how to count money, and did not spend a single extra dollar on decorative elements for buildings where machines stood and chimneys smoked. Construction was subject to the strictest economy. And against the background of this total industrial thrift, we are asked to believe that to install a simple iron tank with water, the same pragmatic people suddenly decided to erect a cyclopean tower with multi-foot walls capable of withstanding a direct hit from a cannonball. Such masonry thickness is not needed to hold the weight of water. It is not needed for thermal insulation. It has no meaning at all in the framework of the water supply system. Moreover, the weight of millions of bricks itself creates a colossal load on the ground, requiring the laying of an incredibly complex and expensive deep foundation. A metal tower distributes the weight point-wise and safely, while a brick castle weighing thousands of tons constantly risks settling and collapsing under its own weight. If we conduct the simplest mathematical analysis of load-bearing capacity, it turns out that the safety margin of these towers exceeds the indicators necessary for water tower needs by hundreds of times. This is like using a bank safe made of armored steel 3 feet thick just to store an empty glass jar inside. Engineering thought always strives for optimization, for finding a balance between reliability and cost. But the creators of these towers seem to have deliberately ignored the laws of economics and common sense. They did not erect just supports for reservoirs. They built capital strongholds, designed for centuries and millennia, possessing incredible spatial rigidity and colossal mass. And if you look at the drawings of water towers from the 20th century, when technologies and materials became cheaper, you will see exactly what logic dictates. Graceful structures on thin supports, crowned with a reservoir. No 6-foot walls, no Gothic masonry. Why then, in the poorer and technologically backward 19th century, did society squander millions of bricks for the simplest technical task? The answer is obvious. They did not squander them. The glaring impracticality is evident not only in the volume of building materials, but also in the very process of organizing the work. To lift a huge amount of heavy cargo to a height of 100 feet would have required unprecedented logistical efforts. We are told about wooden scaffolding and hand winches with which workers hauled loads upward. Mathematical analysis of the laying speed shows that to complete such objects in the timelines cited by the archivists, mason brigades would have had to work at a fantastic, unattainable speed. No horse-drawn carts could have coped with the uninterrupted delivery of thousands of tons of clay and sand. The roads of that time, turning into impassable mud in spring and autumn, simply could not withstand such traffic of heavy wagons. Engineers who knew how to calculate pipe resistance and water pressure could not have been so foolish as to pour an enormously strong foundation at the base of a water tower. A real water tower should be a ventilated, easily maintainable structure where any leaking seam can be patched in a couple of hours. But inside our mysterious brick giants reigns crampedness, and the huge tanks are often crammed in so tightly that maintenance personnel had no opportunity to properly access the walls. This is the clearest evidence that the reservoirs were installed on a residual principle, barbarically embedded into an alien architectural environment. Iron tanks were literally shoved into perfect brick octagons, destroying the unique geometry and violating the original harmony of proportions. This act of technical vandalism is being passed off as a triumph of engineering thought, forcing us to ignore the elementary laws of common sense. We are witnessing a large-scale appropriation of someone else's heritage. The new owners simply took advantage of the ready-made, already standing monumental buildings. It is simpler to take an existing building, break out the internal floors, and install a primitive tank there than to build a complex object from scratch. And then one can boldly report in the archival documents about the solemn opening of the water pumping station, cleverly concealing the historical fact that the building itself had stood in that place long before the appearance of the first water supply. The real truth is hidden in those very thickest walls, which were designed and erected not to hold a metal barrel, but to perform a completely different, mind-boggling task, the keys to unraveling which are embedded in the very form of these structures. If the absurdity of the estimates and the thickness of the walls have made you doubt the official version, then now we will turn to facts that will finally destroy the illusion of normality in what is happening. Divert your attention from the towers themselves and look at the map. Take old topographic plans and mark the locations of these brick colossi on them. You'll discover an astonishing, mathematically precise pattern that defies any logical explanation within the story of simple water pumping stations. All these monumental structures always stand at the highest, dominant geodetic points of the terrain. You will say that this is logical for creating pressure in the pipes? Suppose so. But why then, if you connect these points with lines on a map of a large region, do they form a strict geometric network? The towers are arranged to provide ideal line-of-sight visibility to each other over enormous distances. The distance between neighboring objects can be 6, 12, or even 30 miles, but they are invariably within line-of-sight range. Why would engineers of a local city water supply care about their tower being on the same line and in direct visibility with a similar structure in the neighboring county or even another province? Municipal services, occupied exclusively with supplying a few streets with life-giving moisture, absolutely don't care about geodetic alignment with objects dozens of miles away. This global coordinate grid reveals a completely different, unimaginably large-scale design. Let us continue our visual investigation and turn our attention to the upper tiers of the facades. Almost every such tower harbors yet another glaring architectural anomaly, which historians prefer simply not to notice. We're talking about specific narrow slits in the thickness of the solid brick masonry, very similar to the classic defensive windows of ancient fortresses. They can be arranged in a spiral, wrapping around the tower shaft, or encircling the uppermost, highest levels of the structure. Ask yourself an extremely simple question. Why does a water reservoir need such strange architectural flourishes? Water doesn't need daylight. Moreover, direct sunlight provokes algae blooms and bacterial growth. Maybe they are needed by the plumbers to light the stairs. But why then are these slits made so narrow, tall, and deep, as if they are intended not for letting in diffused light, but for directed focusing? Constructing such complex, narrowing or widening at a certain angle window openings in a 6-foot wall requires jewel-like work from the masons and seriously complicates the entire construction process. If this were a banal utilitarian structure, the stairs would be lit by simple square openings or done without them altogether, using lanterns. However, we see the most complex geometry of slits that are aimed like sights strictly at certain horizons. Moreover, the azimuths of these slits mystically coincide with the directions to neighboring towers of that very geodetic network we talked about earlier. These are not windows for light. These are technological channels for directed transmission of something completely different, which required perfect precision and protection from external interference. If you find yourself inside such a tower and carefully study the construction of these openings, you will notice an interesting detail. The inner jambs often have a complex, non-linear shape that is absolutely meaningless for either lighting or defensive firing. They resemble, rather, the bells of megaphones or elements of a complex optical system. The walls of these slits are laid with astonishing smoothness, sometimes using special-shaped bricks to avoid the slightest irregularities that could scatter or distort the signal passing through them. What kind of flow, exactly? You will, of course, not find the answer to this question in the 19th century waterworks drawings. But you will find traces of crude intervention there. Many of these unique slits were later ruthlessly bricked up with rough brick or filled with concrete, simply because they interfered with the new owners of the towers, attaching iron stairs or laying pipes. Barbarians who seize a high-tech object always destroy what they are unable to comprehend the purpose of. And now let us peek into the holy of holies of academic science, into the historical archives. It would seem that if such grandiose construction projects were implemented in every city in the 19th century, requiring colossal budgets, then the archives should be literally buried under stacks of folders with documentation. There should exist detailed architectural drawings with the layout of every brick, results of large-scale geological surveys of the soil under the foundation, the most detailed estimates for the purchase of millions of units of building material, and payroll records for thousands of workers. But when independent researchers come to the archives intending to study the construction process of a specific tower, they encounter a paradoxical emptiness. In most cases, they are given only a few pitiful scraps of paper, and the most interesting thing is hidden in the wording of these surviving documents. You will almost never find original estimates for the erection of the Cyclopean masonry itself. The documents passed off as proof of construction most often represent bills for ordering a riveted metal tank at the nearest foundry, receipts for the purchase of cast iron pipes, valves, and payment for the work of installers who set up all that iron. Official papers are full of highly ambiguous terms: reconstruction, adaptation, retrofitting, reservoir installation. Do you understand what this means in bureaucratic language? This is the legal formalization of the fact of introducing a new function into an already existing object. The municipality did not build these towers from scratch. The municipality simply took on the balance sheet abandoned, grandiose structures inherited from an unknown era and adapted them for their primitive communal needs. That is exactly why there are no primary drawings of foundations and calculations of load-bearing walls. But there are detailed drawings of how to barbarically break through ancient floors to drag a cast-iron pipe to the top. The falsifiers of the past did an excellent job substituting concepts. They called the year of tank installation the year of construction of the entire tower, and this lie migrated into all modern reference books. The absence of documents on the erection of these giants is often explained by fires, wars, and simple negligence of archivists. But this excuse works only until you start comparing. Somehow the documentation for the construction of simple warehouses, merchants' mansions, and wooden barracks of the same period has been preserved in the finest details. We can find out how many sacks of oats the horses ate during the construction of the provincial post office, but we cannot find a single line about who and how organized the delivery of millions of bricks for erecting a huge polygonal tower on the main square. Records appear exactly at the moment when the word water supply enters the tower's history. Everything that existed before that moment has been erased, crossed out from the chronicles, or reliably hidden in closed storage facilities to which independent researchers have no access. This selective amnesia of official history serves only one purpose: to keep us from realizing that we live amid the ruins of a greatness that does not fit into the permitted picture of the world. We are approaching the most dangerous line of our investigation, beyond which all familiar ideas about humanity's technological past collapse. And what we are about to discover about the creators of these masterpieces will make you see every passerby on the street in a new light. Let us step away from architectural drawings and look at those who supposedly built all this, for official history always tries to convince us that grandiose projects were carried out by simple folk with pickaxes and wooden shovels. Let us turn to the boring but mercilessly precise science of demography. Open the population census data for the 19th century. What do you see there? The vast majority of the planet's population, whether in the Russian Empire, the United States of America, or major European states, consisted of ordinary peasants engaged in grueling manual labor on the land and unskilled factory workers. The overall literacy rate was depressingly low, and technical education was the domain of a tiny privileged elite. Now juxtapose these harsh demographic realities with the scale of the construction underway. To erect hundreds and thousands of the most intricate architectural masterpieces simultaneously across the world required not mere diggers, but vast armies of top-tier engineers, gifted architects, precise surveyors, and hundreds of thousands of master bricklayers of the highest caliber. Where did they source so many qualified specialists? In what universities were they trained at such an incredible speed? How did the synchronous exchange of the most complex engineering expertise occur between continents in an era when the only means of communication was an ordinary paper letter, taking long months to reach the recipient? They paint us an openly fantastic picture of the world, where a society moving on primitive horse-drawn carts along rutted dirt roads suddenly makes an inexplicable technological leap and begins to mass erect perfect geometric structures of unparalleled quality. This technological paradox is utterly impossible to ignore for a healthy mind. On one hand, they show us dim kerosene lamps, draft animal transport, wood heating, and only just emerging attempts to build primitive sewer systems in the largest metropolises. On the other hand, before our eyes stand indestructible towers whose design and construction require the deepest knowledge in the field of strength of materials, higher mathematics, and spatial geometry. This is like trying to assemble the most complex modern microprocessor in a village blacksmith shop using a heavy hammer and anvil. The mismatch between the society's level of development and the complexity of the object standing before our eyes is simply glaring. It destroys the very logic of historical progress. But the real chasm between the official version and physical reality opens at the moment when we enter inside these brick giants and begin to analyze their internal geometry from the point of view of the laws of physics. And here emerges a completely new, shocking factor that academic historians bypass with the most diligent, deathly silence. Most of these ancient towers have inside not just a boring round or square hollow shaft. They represent perfect mathematical octagons, or regular cylinders, which are invariably crowned with the most complex domed vaults. If you have ever been inside such a tower before it was barbarically partitioned off with modern metal platforms, you could not have failed to notice one astonishing physical effect. Inside these structures exist simply fantastic, frighteningly powerful acoustics. Every sound, uttered even in the quietest whisper at the base of the brickwork, is multiplied many times over and transmitted with perfect purity right up to the dome vault. The shape of the inner walls, the junction angles of the octagon's faces, the lining material, absolutely everything works as a giant, impeccably calculated resonator. Sound waves do not decay in space, but are multiply reflected and focused at strictly defined points of this geometry. The question arises, why does a reservoir with ordinary water need perfect acoustic architecture? Water, by its physical nature, absorbs sound and dampens vibrations. Cast iron pipes, metal valves, and steam pumps create only chaotic technical noise. For a primitive communal object, acoustics has absolutely no significance. Moreover, erecting a perfect octagonal resonator with a domed sound reflector makes construction many times more expensive and complex. Builders of the 19th century, if they were truly the authors of these monumental buildings, would never have spent years on the perfect calculation of sound wave behavior for a banal city water pumping station. This is an absolutely senseless waste of colossal mental and physical efforts. The shape of the dome and faces is designed according to the strictest laws of physics of wave processes. Before us is a mathematically precise resonance chamber, capable of capturing, multiply amplifying, and precisely directing vibrations of a certain frequency. And this incredible internal structure utterly shatters the theory of a primitive hydrotechnical structure. Try for at least a moment to imagine the true level of the most complex mathematical calculations necessary to create such a cyclopean acoustic mirror from millions of fired bricks. The chief engineer had to precisely calculate the wavelength, angles of multiple reflections from the walls, density of the building material, and even the influence of the external environment temperature on signal propagation. Such calculations are categorically impossible to perform roughly, sitting at a crude wooden table in the dim light of a tallow candle. These are indisputable signs of the existence of a highly developed civilization that possessed a completely different, deepest understanding of the laws of nature and wave physics. And this mysterious civilization quite obviously existed on our planet long before the people we today consider our forefathers stepped onto the historical stage. Official science desperately tries to cram these most complex technological objects into the narrow Procrustean bed of the primitive steam era, stubbornly ignoring the most obvious conclusion. The society of carts and kerosene lanterns did not design and build these acoustic towers. It simply found them already ready. Imagine the real picture of what happened. After some large-scale upheaval or radical change of historical eras, the new owners of the world discover a ready-made global network of magnificent, vacant buildings of enormous strength. They completely do not understand their original true purpose. They do not know what to do with this perfect internal acoustics and strange vertical slits on the upper tiers. But the new, uneducated owners perfectly understand one thing. This is an excellent, incredibly high and reliable brick support. And then the most primitive, cruel, and barbaric decision of all possible is made. Into this perfect architectural resonator, a heavy riveted iron tank is roughly shoved using winches. The ideal centuries-old masonry is mercilessly breached with heavy crowbars and sledgehammers to pass rusty water pipes through it. The most complex acoustic system is forever destroyed, turning the true masterpiece of engineering thought into a banal, dirty stand for a huge barrel of liquid. It is precisely this sad moment of technical vandalism that was sparingly recorded in those very rare archival documents we spoke about in detail earlier. Ordinary documents for the purchase and installation of a metal reservoir were later passed off as full documents for the construction of the entire monumental building. Thus, before our eyes, the greatest substitution of historical concepts occurred. Yesterday's craftsmen, hastily dressed in strict suits of government officials and chief engineers, brazenly appropriated the great achievements of the previous, much more technologically advanced era. They proudly hung commemorative plaques with their names on foreign high-tech objects and forced all subsequent generations to believe that this architectural cosmos was created solely for the banal washing of floors and laundry. Every day we look at the silent monuments of the greatest deception, where the external form completely contradicts the primitive content imposed on us. Huge acoustic chambers, steadfastly standing on high geodetic points across our planet, patiently await their hour to finally reveal the main secret of their origin. They were erected decades or even centuries before ordinary water was first let into them, and their true original purpose was so global, large-scale, and revolutionary that full understanding of this historical fact is capable of once and for all turning all of modern fundamental science upside down. The preparation is complete. All false myths are destroyed, and now we have come right up to the most important question. If these are categorically not water towers, then what were they in reality? The answer lies in those very sound waves, mysterious narrow embrasures, and strict mathematical network. The time has come to tear off the masks and speak aloud that very frightening truth, for the concealment of which millions of pages of academic textbooks were rewritten. Before us are not just scattered whimsical buildings, but surviving nodes of a single, global, pre-industrial information network. This is the real stone internet of the past, a grandiose infrastructure of optical and acoustic communication that spanned entire continents long before humanity entwined the planet with copper telegraph wires. The creators of this incredible civilization did not need electricity in our modern understanding, because they perfectly mastered the physics of wave processes, optics, and mechanical resonance. Each so-called water tower was a super powerful server, retranslator, and router of this planetary communication web. Now put together all the scattered facts we discussed in detail earlier, and you will instantly see the impeccable engineering picture. The towers always stand at the highest geodetic elevations, forming ideal line-of-sight visibility over tens of miles. In their thick walls at the very top tiers are located narrow, incredibly deep slits, oriented strictly toward neighboring nodes of this gigantic chain. This is nothing other than directed optical and acoustic channels for high-speed transmission of information packets. Let us break down the operating technology of this astonishing system in the smallest details, relying exclusively on the laws of classical physics. Let us begin with the most powerful optical telegraph. Inside the upper tier of the tower, behind those very narrow window embrasures, was located a complex system of focusing lenses, parabolic mirrors, and mechanical shutters. The most powerful light source, whether a directed beam of reflected sunlight by day or some other lost technology of bright combustion at night, was focused through these narrow slits. The narrowing geometry of the window openings worked as an ideal collimator, completely cutting off excess scattered light and forming an extremely dense, narrowly directed light beam. This signal, encoded with a complex visual protocol, almost instantly covered the enormous distance to the next tower. There, the duty operator, or an automatic mechanical system, read the bright flashes through receiving lenses and immediately retransmitted them further along the chain in the required direction. Thus, the most important state, commercial, navigational, or precise meteorological information flew across vast countries at absolute light speed. What took horse couriers with leather mailbags long months of grueling travel, this optical network transmitted in mere minutes. However, any optical communication critically depended on weather conditions. Dense fog, heavy snowfall, or heavy downpour could completely interrupt the light beam transmission. And it is precisely here that the second, even more astonishing function of these monumental structures came into play, namely, acoustic data transmission. Recall that very perfect internal geometry of the towers, these mathematically precise giant octagons and the most complex domed vaults, creating simply insane sound resonance. Inside these deaf chambers were located colossal mechanical low-frequency sound generators. These could be massive metal bells of special casting, giant steel tuning forks, powerful pneumatic sirens, or complex vibrating plates. Upon activation of such a huge generator, a most powerful sound wave of a strictly defined frequency arose inside the tower. The perfectly smooth inner walls reflected this dense sound, the spherical dome focused it, and the multi-foot thickness of the outer brick masonry prevented the colossal acoustic energy from scattering uselessly into the surrounding space. The entire monstrous power of the resonance was gathered into a beam and directed outward through those very narrow windows. Low-frequency infrasound possesses colossal penetrating ability and hardly attenuates over enormous distances, easily piercing any bad weather. The neighboring tower, built according to the same strict mathematical proportions, worked at that moment as a giant receiving ear. Its inner huge volume was precisely tuned to the same resonant frequency, just as a guitar string starts to vibrate if a similar note sounds nearby. The incoming, weakened sound signal from afar was captured, multiply amplified by the domed architecture and precisely read by the operators. This was a redundant, all-weather communication system of incredible engineering reliability. The entire network together represented a single living mechanism, constantly pulsing with the most important information. The nodes continuously exchanged data, coordinated global logistics, provided the most precise sound navigation in poor visibility conditions, and maintained unbroken connectivity of the vast world civilization. And now it becomes crystal clear why the engineers needed to use millions of high-quality bricks and erect heavy walls of incredible thickness. Such colossal mass and spatial rigidity of the structure were vitally necessary to dampen parasitic vibrations so that the tower itself simply wouldn't fall apart from the constant, monstrous acoustic resonance inside its walls. Every tiniest architectural detail served a strictly defined technological function. But then, some fatal catastrophe occurred. The global communication structure collapsed for reasons unknown to us, whether a large-scale demographic crisis, economic collapse, or complete change of societal management paradigm. Completely new, ignorant owners arrived, those very people in strict suits from the official chronicle of the 19th century. They looked at these majestic communication nodes as primitive savages look at a complex clock mechanism. They completely did not understand the principles of operation of acoustic resonators, and the optical lenses and unique mechanics were simply looted, sent for melting down, or thrown onto the dump of history. The infrastructure of the great technological past was barbarically gutted. However, the new pragmatic authorities quickly realized that the empty, indestructible brick giants were excellent for the role of banal, high supports. An act of unprecedented historical looting and total degradation began. Into the former perfect resonators, mercilessly breaching the centuries-old masonry, they dragged dirty iron water cisterns. The embrasure windows, through which terabytes of priceless information used to fly, were roughly bricked up. The most complex servers of the pre-industrial era were forever turned into primitive water pipes. To reliably conceal this fact of shameful appropriation of foreign technologies, the archivists carefully rewrote the documents, passing off the destruction of ancient communication nodes as great construction. Let us realize even deeper the scale of this technology stolen from humanity. This optoacoustic network operated on principles that astonishingly resemble the architecture of the modern digital internet. In each such tower, judging by its complex internal layout, there were various levels of access and information processing. The lower, massive floors could serve for housing support mechanisms, systems of gears and counterweights that drove the heavy shutters of directed megaphones. The middle tiers were intended for personnel engaged in deciphering and routing incoming signals, translating optical flashes into standardized logs and passing them to the acoustic workshop for further all-weather retransmission. The upper floors were a clean zone for reception and transmission. The precision with which these objects were positioned on the terrain requires knowledge of advanced geodesy and cartography of the highest level. It is impossible to build a chain of dozens of towers many miles apart from each other without understanding the curvature of the Earth and the most precise mathematical calculations of the relief. This completely rules out the version that the towers were built spontaneously as cities grew and waterworks needs arose. The entire network was designed simultaneously by a single planning center, possessing resources on a planetary scale. We live among the silent skeletons of the greatest engineering triumph. Those who came after the builders of this network committed not just an act of architectural vandalism, they committed a crime against reason, forcing entire generations of engineers and architects to study the fake history of primitive water pumping stations, hiding from them the true potential of wave mechanics and acoustic physics. They left us only a pathetic illusion of progress, while the real, pure, and grandiose data transmission technologies were mercilessly destroyed for control over humanity and absolute monopoly on information in the new industrial world. Realizing the fact that the greatest pre-industrial system of global optical and acoustic communication was coldly destroyed and turned into banal reservoirs for pumping technical fluid inevitably raises a chilling question. If the falsifiers of history were able to so easily deceive entire generations, making us unconditionally believe in the outright engineering and economic absurdity on the example of the most noticeable, dominating over old cities' brick buildings, then in what deeply artificial reality do we exist today at all? The scale of this cynical historical forgery goes far beyond simple architectural theft or bureaucratic error. From all of humanity, they stole not just majestic stone resonators and masterpieces of Gothic masonry, they brazenly stole a completely different, pure, and harmonious path of technological development. Think for a second about why academic science, with such incredible, painful persistence, ignores the study of wave physics, perfect geometric proportions, and macroacoustics in application to civil architecture. This is not a random omission of absent-minded professors. This is a rigid, targeted blockade of fundamental knowledge. Having captured the most important nodes of the old world stone internet, the new self-proclaimed rulers of the 19th century did not just break out the focusing lenses from the window embrasures and mercilessly smash the mechanical sound generators with sledgehammers. They intentionally, consciously redirected the entire vector of scientific progress toward the primitive burning of coal, the mass laying of vulnerable copper wires, and the total dependence of every person on centralized sources of electricity. The falsification of history became the most powerful weapon of enslaving the mind. The previous grandiose optoacoustic network was absolutely autonomous, ecologically flawless, and completely independent of large-scale extraction of harmful fossil fuel. It utilized eternal, immutable natural laws of mechanical resonance and optical focusing, providing ultra-high-speed, uninterrupted communication even in conditions of complete collapse of the resource-based energy we are accustomed to today. Such a decentralized, indestructible communication system was practically impossible to control for the emerging global corporate monopolies and bankers. That is why it had to not just be physically broken, but forever, with special cruelty, erased from the collective memory of society, the very seditious idea that planetary communication can work without huge financial costs, without fragile copper insulators, and without polluting the atmosphere smoking power plants. We were all forcibly driven into the paradigm of artificial technological vulnerability. He who today has a stranglehold on the copper cable or modern fiber optic line unconditionally controls the entire modern world, because he can sever this vital cable at any second, leaving entire independent countries and vast continents in total informational isolation and chaos. The ancient, highly developed communication network, relying on the perfect mathematical geometry of monumental buildings and the fundamental physics of infrasound, belonged to the planet itself and all its free inhabitants. It could not be switched off with a single flick of a switch in the closed office of some influential official. It could only be physically, barbarically destroyed by bricking up the directed embrasures with cheap, rough brick and shoving heavy cast-iron tanks with rusty water main water inside. We have grown accustomed to arrogantly considering ourselves the absolute pinnacle of evolution, proudly clutching expensive, fragile electronic gadgets in our hands. But in harsh reality, we are merely blind users of an incredibly fragile surrogate system, hastily built on the ruins of the true engineering greatness of the past. We are like naive tourists, carelessly wandering amid the debris of a great pre-industrial civilization, suffering from the deepest historical amnesia, and obediently accepting grand data transmission servers as ordinary municipal water pumping stations. This grandiose, unprecedented in its scale deception bears not only a technological, but also the deepest psychological character, the terrible consequences of which we observe absolutely every day in all spheres of our life. Over many generations, we were diligently trained in schools and universities not to notice the perfectly obvious architectural absurdity. We were conditioned to indifferently gaze every day at the thick, 6-foot walls of the most complex masonry from millions of bricks, and obediently, like programmed robots, repeat learned mantras about the strange, illogical whims of past city authorities. This was a cruel but incredibly effective global test of absolute submission of the mind, which all modern humanity failed with a deafening crash. When you finally stop trusting your own eyes, when you voluntarily and thoughtlessly ignore the most elementary laws of mathematical analysis, sound logic, strength of materials, and harsh commercial economics in favor of the text written in a cheap tourist booklet, you inevitably become an ideal, obedient object for absolutely any political manipulations. If you can successfully, without meeting any resistance, sell the most absurd fairy tale about a palace for a water pressure pipe, then you can easily impose absolutely any social illusion, making you believe in the most outright lie. Today, we are fully, every day, reaping the bitter fruits of this mass intellectual blinding. We live in old cities whose original hidden geometry was carefully designed by true geniuses of wave mechanics. But we use these sacred spaces only to lay smoking asphalt over them and pull endless dirty pipes of household sewage. We are densely surrounded on all sides by monumental artifacts of the highest level of development, but we stubbornly, to the point of hoarseness, continue to consider our direct ancestors unwashed, backward people who could barely manage wooden horse-drawn carts. Every such monumental brick building on your home street is not just a beautiful ancient monument requiring scheduled restoration. It is a silent, unbearably heavy reproach to our common intellectual cowardice. A cry for help, frozen in eternal stone, from the erased great past, which we stubbornly refuse to hear and understand. But the true historical truth always possesses one astonishing, truly crushing, and inevitable property. It inevitably, slowly, but absolutely surely, breaks through any, even the thickest layers of official cement plaster and modern grey concrete. Those majestic giants, which the new owners of life simply could not demolish to the ground due to their astonishing, colossal strength and mortar quality, today begin reluctantly, bit by bit, to reveal their most intimate secrets to independent researchers and free engineers. The unique internal acoustics of the domed vaults, the strange, inexplicable geodetic anomalies of their precise positioning on the map, the most intricate, complex optical calculations of the narrowing embrasures, absolutely all of this is right now inexorably coming together into a single, irrefutable, rock-solid picture of a grandiose technological heritage that was mercilessly taken from us, classified, and hidden in dusty archives. You and I are standing right now on the most dangerous threshold of the greatest tectonic reappraisal of who we really are, what our true potential is, and where we truly came from into this complex world. Perhaps right at this very moment, while you are listening to these words with utmost attention, in the center of your hometown, a similarly grandiose brick tower proudly rises in complete solitude, silently, through merciless centuries, preserving the great secrets of the unified, pre-industrial stone internet. It incredibly patiently awaits that inevitable moment when fully awakened people stop looking at it as a ridiculous, ugly relic of a dirty communal past and finally see in its strict forms the coveted key to the forgotten, barbarically destroyed knowledge of the ancestors.